Welcome back to a special edition of the Echo Podcast. Normally we talk through a bunch of different topics, go over a bunch of things for you guys, but Knable here decided to bring up in our last episode a very, very interesting topic, which I think deserves an entire segment. Now, this might not be as long as some of our other segments, but we're going to talk through. I'll just let him bring it back to the table so we can do it from his perspective.
So we kind of left off with, I guess, the practical application versus literature, right? So I kind of brought up, as you guys know, I train in a more science-based approach as well, but I do sometimes think practical application may triumph the literature. So the question I'm asking is, essentially the whole world, right, is one big science experiment, in theory, right? Mm-hmm. So if you're seeing an outcome happen, over and over and over again, but the literature says something else, how would you kind of combat that?
Sure.
As to, or what would you decide to go with? Like, let's say A produces B in this scenario, but the literature says B would produce C, but we kind of always see the same B result in the real world.
Yeah. So first things first, you guys obviously know that I typically base my recommendations for you guys off of literature. But there are going to be times when there are things that I've seen in my practical experience where I'll put them out to you guys. Now, my general practice has been to tell you guys. So if I see something happening and I've recognized this over time, I typically will tell you guys this is not based off of a study. This is just what I've experienced. If you experience something different, understandable, because it's not something that I'm basing off of a literature perspective. Now, as far as when we just see things as coaches that seem to disagree with the literature over and over again, I will say this: there are levels of evidence when it comes to science, and this is where people fail to understand how to properly read literature. What they will do is they will often base their entire opinion of a topic off of one study. And when you don't understand how studies are formatted, when you don't understand the process they go through, when you don't understand what actually goes into a study itself, it can be very easy to make your opinions off of what we refer to as false positives. So not every study should hold the same amount of weight as another. You have levels to it. You have individual topics. You have meta-analyses. And then you have reviews that are taking a look at even multiple meta-analyses. And at a certain point, it becomes unavoidable. Okay, this is the way it is. We know this based on this literature. But there are plenty of topics, especially within the realm of health and fitness, nutrition, where we only have maybe one study or two or three. And so if you're basing your entire opinion of a topic off of one study, unless that study was made in such a good format that it's impossible to refute or nearly impossible to refute, to put all of your eggs into that basket, in my opinion, is misguided. And I think a lot of people have done that. So they'll find an individual study on a topic and say, well, the literature says this. It's like, well, I mean, the literature currently says this.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of things that actually change over time, a lot of recommendations that change over time as the literature is updated. So let me think if I can think of any examples. I would say even things like volume recommendations, intensity, these things have been something where we thought we knew the precise answer in the early 2000s. And then as we got closer to 2010, there were some changes. Even now, you're seeing studies come out that are having different recommendations, or there's different practical takeaways for different studies when it comes to volume, intensity, muscle groups being trained in certain ways, because it's such a new field. We're not dealing with physics, where it's like, okay, there's very little that changes from year to year in the world of physics, because we've been studying it for hundreds of years. Because it's such a new topic, I think this is also part of the reason why some coaches are so much better than others, because the ones who have actually developed the experience have been through these scenarios, have lived through these scenarios, have seen hundreds of people live through these scenarios and have been able to formulate better opinions than just, oh, I read somewhere once that this is the case.
Gotcha. Yeah. Would you say there was anything you noticed with a client where you had to do something that was against the literature?
I would say there's been various circumstances where, and this one's gonna drive people crazy because you guys kind of know my overall stance on things. I would say some people do respond better to higher volume training. And I think there's a variety of reasons this can happen. And I think it's also, I think a lot of my views have been misconstrued on this as well. Because when people hear me say lower volume, they leave out the And so a lot of people just hear low. And then they oh, Mike Menser.
I think higher volume, personally, I've noticed too with clients, is something that you can kind of adapt to as well. And the literature won't show that either. So,
yeah, although there was a recent study that came out that was taking a look at people who were training. I believe it was with 2 RIR. That was the supposed training for quads, which, I mean, quads are kind of a hard one because a lot of people stop short when it comes to quads. But regardless, they were training with, I believe, 2 RIR, and they had a set progression over the course of the study. And you had 20 sets. One group stayed with just 20 sets. Another group increased by, I believe it was a set per week, where another group increased by like 2 or 3 sets per week. And they found that the groups that increased their sets per week they increased all the way up to 52 sets per week, they experienced more growth than the ones that stayed at 20 than the ones that got up to somewhere in the 30s. And so a lot of people have run with that and said, oh, well, this means that higher volume training is superior, especially when you taper your volume upwards. And I think that's also short-sighted because, again, we're looking at an individual study. And so this is where I think a lot of people get, this is where you have to take a look at experience again, because every single person that has walked away from this study saying, oh, I shouldn't say every single person, but almost every person who's science-based or considered science-based who's walked away from this study has said, well, we still wouldn't recommend doing 52 sets.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, why? Because they have experience, because they understand, okay, you can't sustain this. Okay, if you're doing 52 sets for quads, something's wrong.
Yeah.
Like you're either not going hard enough or you're not, because they understand what will happen to the body when you try and do this over and over again. So at this point, does that mean that they're saying the literature is wrong? Or does it mean that there's something underlying this where they're okay with taking the conclusion that higher volume might be better, but they're not okay with actually putting it into practice?
Yeah.
And so why is that? Because of experience. And so that's where we got to say, okay, is it the 52 sets, or was it something about a novel stimulus, or was it just the fact that they weren't actually training as close to failure as they thought they were, so there were more stimulating reps? There's so many questions that you can develop from studies, but too often people want to take conclusions from studies rather than what can this lead us to in the future? What can this teach us? What can we take from this, and how can we apply it, rather than black and white, here's the answer, everything else is completely wrong.
There's never a black and white answer.
No.
And the thing is, like, applying it, each person is obviously an individual. So, like, as a coach, when applying certain things to people, like, let's say, for example, you have certain machines that obviously, you know, are better biomechanically.
Mm-hmm.
But at least for me, for example, you got to take into consideration what that individual person's body anatomy is.
Absolutely.
So let's say, think something like, you know, the prime, like chest supported extreme row that they have in Alpha Land.
Mm-hmm.
So, right, that good machine biomechanically, right? So for someone like me with longer arms, right, what actually ends up happening is your wrist will end up tracking inside your elbow. So for me, it's hitting a lot of bicep, not as much of the target area I want. So it's things like that where you kind of, obviously that's just like a very, you know, little general example, but it's things like that that you kind of have to take into consideration with each person and applying it individually.
It matters.
Yeah.
It matters. I just took on a 6'7" guy. We've had to change. Like, we're gonna have to change everything. Like, I sent him a program. He started working through it. He was sending me his video sets. I'm like, okay, we can't do that.
Yeah.
We can't do that because I can see the issues while he's doing the exercise. He's doing a chest press that converges, and he's starting in here and finishing here because it's not made for a person who's 6'7". Like, okay, we're gonna need to move to a Smith machine or something else. And sure, it might not converge, but at the same time, he's not getting what he needs to out of that machine.
Yeah.
So for somebody like him, why on earth would I say, oh yeah, converging machine makes sense?
Because the literature says
exactly.
That's what people will
have to take those things into account. But I think you said one thing, which I kind of agree with, and like, you're going to agree with me right away when I say it. But you said nothing is black and white, which is both true and not true, because when you say that, you're obviously referring to like things that are actually like debatable.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But I've seen people take and run with that so far, where it's like, the way that they take
like
that.
If you eat less food, you're gonna get fatter. Like stuff.
Exactly. And that's where we start to run into the real issues, is when people are flat out denying laws of science. That's where we run into issues. So, like, when you said, where do you take experience over this? I would say because there are coaches out there, especially in the TikTok world, which drives me absolutely insane, who will legitimately say caloric deficits don't work for weight loss. And I'm like, at that point, you're going so far against science. They're going so far against everything we understand when it comes to thermodynamics that we're no longer even talking about just fitness. Yeah. We're talking about a law of the universe here. And that's where it's like, when you say, oh, not everything's black and white, people will take it to that level of extreme. And that's where I say experience does not triumph, because those people's experience is just people lying.
Yeah.
It's just, oh, I was on 600 calories a day and I didn't lose weight.
Really eating 600 calories.
Exactly. And so it's like,
so rarely is it some actual health issue.
Yeah.
You see that. I've seen that with clients.
A 600 calorie.
No, not. I'm saying like,
exactly. Once you get to
I've seen someone with thyroid issues that wasn't, losing weight in
what you would typically consider. Exactly. And that's the thing. There's always going to be ranges. There's always going to be variance. But when you're going outside of a variance to such a degree that the person would have to be a different species in order for it to even happen, that's where a lot of people get mixed up, because they see a level of variance between individuals and they assume that level of variance can go to such extremes that it doesn't even physically make sense. So, for example, and that's one that's super interesting.
People love to run with the thyroid thing.
They do.
When it's very uncommon.
Right. And even when it does happen, what you find is, like, again, if you go to the literature, what you find is thyroid can make a difference of maybe a few hundred calories or so. Yeah. But in the end, no matter what, a 200-pound individual is going to lose weight on 500 calories.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter who, doesn't matter where. And the reason for that is because the organs and stuff cannot function unless the actual physical processes within the body cannot function unless you've got, and I don't want to misquote anything, but if you were to take and add up the organs, no matter who, it's going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 800 to 1,000 calories just for the organs to function. And that's not including a lot of other processes as well that you have throughout the day, that you have just by living in general. And so it's one of those things where I try to make people aware of studies that have taken a look at tissue expenditure and stuff like that and how it works. Because until you do that, it's, well, I just am a little bit more, I'm just more than this person. I'm just more this. And that will only happen to a certain degree.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of people take and run with the adaptive metabolism thing as well, which is a thing, right? Like
that's the problem. there's always grains of truth.
Yeah.
That's the real issue.
So it's like, yeah, it might be, you might have to push a little. Like, even for me, I think I have a little bit of an adaptive metabolism.
Well, everybody does.
Yeah. Where it's like, I might have to bring my calories a little bit lower than someone my size, but in order to gain size, I'm also going to have to push them a little bit higher.
Right.
So I've seen a lot of people take that and run where it's like, oh, I have an adaptive metabolism and I'm eating 800 calories as a 250-pound guy and I'm not losing weight. So it's people, I think it's just people trying to find an excuse.
Right.
Which...
Well, here's and we're not going to go too much into the weeds just because we've covered a little bit of the topic that I wanted to cover already, but this is something that is interesting enough that I do want to leave you guys off with this, because a lot of people have asked me, okay, how does it work when it comes to adaptive metabolism? I've never really been able to answer that for you guys in terms of a long form content response. So what he's referring to here, the fact of your metabolism being a little bit higher, a little bit lower, dependent on various factors, is absolutely true. Like, and I think far too often when people hear calories in, calories out, they assume you have a maintenance, and that's what it is, and that it doesn't change. It's like the only way it might change is if you start doing a whole lot more cardio or doing a whole lot less cardio, but that's not true. There are a lot of physical processes that go in. To adapt upwards than it does downwards. So you, for example, I think you said before we started on here that you're on about 4,300 calories.
Yeah.
So I actually have a client right now who's smaller than you, who's not doing insane amounts of cardio or anything like that, and he actually eats above 5,000 calories. And that is what he actually requires in order to put on size. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So what are your calories get up to?
I've been as high at one point at 7,000. Not this off season. This off season they didn't get too crazy. I think like 56 was the highest.
Okay. And you were able to put on size with that amount.
I'm not someone, like I said, I've noticed sometimes, like with the adaptive metabolism thing, like I needed to push really high.
Yep.
But this year really didn't have to go too high.
And here's the thing. I'm not going to sit here and be like, oh, no, well, you must be lying about this, because I have seen time and time again that there are people that have to push their calories up much higher. And that is just the way it works. So he might even, like, if we were to take a look at adaptive metabolism in literature, perhaps he falls outside of the upper bounds of what we've seen in the literature. But the literature can only deal with so many people at a time. That doesn't mean that you say it's false. That doesn't mean that you say it's not possible. You just have to understand that some people are going to fall outside of those limits. Now, once you start getting to a certain point, standard deviations, you start doing the mathematical calculations, the chances that somebody is going to be outside of a certain deviation, that's when you start to run into the issues. So perhaps he doesn't align with the literature. Maybe he does. I haven't actually looked at the upper bounds of adaptive metabolism when it comes to literature. But I've seen in enough people over and over them eating as many calories as they are that we know that it can adapt upwards a lot. But I've also seen in literature not a single person in documented history get down to 500 calories as a 200 plus pound individual and not lose weight. So you understand once you get to that point, and especially when you work with those people time and time again, and this is where the experience comes in, where every single time I have ever worked with somebody who has come to me and said, I eat X amount and I'm not losing weight. And it is a ridiculous amount. 700 calories, 230 pound individual. I'm like, okay, shoot me pictures of everything you eat for the day. Like, log your food and let's go with it. And they do it. Not a single one of them has ever sent me pictures of 700 calories. Or when they did, their weight, because I'd have them send me their weigh-ins too, would just precipitously start dropping.
Yeah.
And it would not stop until they started sending me pictures of things that were above that amount.
I noticed a lot too, like if you, like this could be good for someone that's newer into coaching. Like let's say you have someone down to like 1,800 calories and they're not losing weight. You're like, why? What's now? You look at their recovery, their sleep, You get them blood work. 99% of the time, they're just cheating on their diet.
Yep.
That's what I notice.
Yep.
So it's a lot of I myself used to be like, why isn't this person losing weight? Like, I'd be like, get blood work, get this. And now it's just like, dude, I know you're eating, a little extra peanut butter. You're eating a little extra rice. Like, that's usually
the hardest part is being honest with yourself. And the more you're honest with yourself, the more you'll see those things line up. And I think one of the most important things that I've started incorporating, I shouldn't say started, but the thing that I incorporate for people is things that standardize everything. So like if they say, well, I'm eating this amount, nothing's happening, what I will say is, all right, well, you're going to eat the exact same thing every single day. And then we'll just take away from that each time. And it's like, without fail, if they're eating the same thing every single day, as long as you're taking away from the same thing they're eating every single day, there's no way to cheat that. And that's where things can get a little bit monotonous. But again, we're getting a little bit further away from what we originally started talking about. But yes, I do believe at some level there is going to be some times where you have to go with experience over what the current available literature is. But I always hope for the literature to get better over time for every single topic. But great question by Knable, and I don't even know how long we ended up going with this, but it was probably longer than we meant to. So I hope you guys got some value from this, and hopefully we'll have you on again.
Looking forward to be back on.